Hello friends, good evening and welcome to my class. I am Mohammad Tarique. Today we are going to discuss Indian Council Act 1909, which is also popularly known as Morley Minto Reform. Now Morley, as you all may be knowing, was Secretary of State for India, and Minto was Viceroy and Governor General between 1905 to 1910. Now, any act, past or present, if you understand under the three headings which I have made for you, you can never miss any question for the main, that is for sure. And most questions related to prelims exam, whether for UPSC or state PCS, you can also attempt through these scientific methods of division of a topic. Now the acts can be understood under the three headings which I have designed. One is background of the act, or you can say the circumstances in which a particular act was passed. For instance, if you just check it today, there are a lot of acts recently passed. For instance, Triple Talaq Act was passed. There was SC/ST Act passed recently after Supreme Court judgment. There is NRC, which has been passed by Lok Sabha and about to be passed by Rajya Sabha. So, what are the background behind NRC, Triple Talaq, SC/ST Act? If you just follow the last 6 months news, 1 year news, and you would know that there was some background behind it, because the act does not come out of blue. It comes out of a particular socio-economic, socio-political background, and no good student of law can understand an act without knowing the background. And even the judges, when they deliver judgment, they go about the background of the act to understand the nuances of the provision of the act and the purpose behind making a particular act. Second important thing, what are the major provisions? Of course, each act has, as you know, many provisions, but some of the provisions makes a particular act very famous or sometimes infamous. In case of Morley Minto Reform, there was some infamous provision, of course, from Indian point of view, that we will discuss. The last and the most important is critical evaluation. You can also call it significance of a particular act. You can also call the impact of the act after certain period, or the consequences of act. Now, when we say critical evaluation, it means that we have to weigh, we have to see whether there were some positives, whether there were some negatives, and after weighing all, which one was more heavier? The positives were more heavier or the negatives were more heavier? And then you can make a conclusion. Now, this is the way you should prepare any act, as I told, past or present. Now, three acts are very important in modern Indian history. I hope some of you may know. 1909 Indian Council Act, 1919 Government of India Act, and 1935 again Government of India Act. Now, already they have asked question 2 years back on 1935 Act, and you know the question which they asked was actually exactly the same which I just told you. That question which was related to the third part of the topic, and that third part was the critical evaluation, because the question was that without the making of 1935 Act, the government, the Constitution of India would have been, difficult for Indian makers of constitution. That was the question which was part of this act. Now let's start the background of the act called Morley Minto Reform. You know, when you write background, you have to understand that just in and around 1909, what happened in Indian politics. One big event was 1905, as you all know, that was Swadeshi movement. Then 1906, formation of Muslim League. So, what are those important points which you have to learn to write about the background? The background was that in the late 19th century, that is 1890s, and the first few hundred years from 1900 to 1908, what we notice that the political activities in certain parts of India, particularly in two parts, one is Bengal and another in Pune region. Now, in these two regions, the political activities was much more active than other parts of the India, and three important type of political class had emerged. One, the moderates. And as you know that the moderates were mostly relying on a particular method of protest, that is prayers, that is petitions, that is applications and requests, meetings with the officials. Then another group which had emerged during this period were extremists, as you all heard, the very famous Lal Bal Pal and their chief Aurobindo Ghosh. Now, these people relied mostly in the form of boycott, as they did in Swadeshi movement, in the form of a strike of workers and various other public services, in the form of public meetings, which were in those days not actually allowed, then in the form of writing aggressively in pamphlets as well as newspapers and questioning and criticizing the governments. They also used posters, which were very common in those days. Now, these were not violent. Make sure that the word which we use are extremist does not mean that they were violent. Okay, this is a misconception. The group which were believed and believing in violence, they were actually revolutionaries. The British told or called them as terrorists, so we should avoid this word. And there is another term which is much better, that is militant nationalist. Okay, in Hindi there is a term krantikari, in Urdu there is a term inqalabi. That is much better term for these people. Now these people who used violent means, right? So there are three groups which had emerged during this period. One group, as I told, were the moderates, another group were extremists, and the third group, as I just told you, were the revolutionaries. Now, obviously, in such a situation, for any government, there was a big tension, big headache. So, the government of the day thought to bring some what they called reform, so that they could control this political situation, and their target was actually moderate, because they knew that if some political and constitutional reforms are offered, at least moderate would accept. And their plan was like, once they are under control, they can easily then control the extremists and revolutionaries. That was the strategy which they had now made, and in this background, Morley and Minto Reform was brought, which was enacted in 1909 as Indian Council Act. Now, another thing which I told happened in the same period, that in 1906 Muslim League was founded, as you know, at Dhaka. Now this was a small group in the beginning and mainly led by some Muslim elite, mostly Nawabs and Zamindars, and they were interested in more political representation of Muslims in the assembly and the parliament at that time called Imperial Council. And you have to understand, though it is called Muslim League, but they didn't care or were concerned about Muslim middle class or Muslim peasant or Muslim workers or Muslim women in large number. So sometimes the names like Muslim League can be misleading one. So it was an elite and it was for elite. And they were most concerned about political representation of Muslims of the time rather than about their education, about their health, about their unemployment, farmers' problem, or the workers' problem. Sorry. So this group, led by Aga Khan, Mohsinul Mulk, Waqarul Mulk, and Nawab Salimullah, this group who had founded this Muslim League at Dhaka, they met Governor General Lord Minto at Shimla. Now they proposed and demanded that the Muslims should get separate electorate. And what is separate electorate? I would explain to you shortly. The British saw a great opportunity in groups like Muslim League, mainly to counter INC, which had become a big headache for British at that time, particularly after Swadeshi movement. So to counter Indian National Congress and their movement, they now would use some of the clauses so that it may appear that they are supporting a group of Muslims to challenge and corner, the rising nationalist movement. So in this background, the reforms were initiated, and you have to be careful. The word reform were actually generally used by the British. It is still questionable whether it was really a reform. So this so-called reform was enacted in 1909 as Indian Council Act. Now the second part, as I told, which we have to know what were its provisions. So you have to be careful about those provisions. Number one, the size of Imperial Council. Imperial Council was Central Legislative Council, and in those days it had only one house, was expanded, and it was now brought to 69. Earlier it was between 12 to 18, so it is more than 5 times the number was increased, right? Similarly, the size of provincial legislative assembly or council were also expanded, and each state of course had different size. Then you write separate electorate, and this is what I said the most controversial clause was given. I don't know you know it or not, but whatever you know, I know you know partially. Separate electorate was given to Hindu zamindars. It was given to Indian Muslims, and it was also given to Chamber of Commerce, Calcutta, Chamber of Commerce, Bombay. Now, under separate electorate, the candidate had to be from that community. For instance, the community is Muslim, and the voter also would be only Muslim. Or suppose in a particular constituency which was reserved for Chamber of Commerce, Calcutta, so the candidate would come from that chamber and the voter would also come from that chamber. That means there were two types of constituency. One was called general electorate and one was called separate electorate. From general electorate, anybody could contest. From separate electorate, only that could contest which for which it was reserved. But unlike in reserved seats of current day, only the candidate would be from the reserved category, but the voter would be from all community living in that area. Whereas in separate electorate, both candidate and voter would come from same community. And what would be its repercussion, I will of course explain it to you at later stage. So this was one important clause. Another important clause of this act was that one Indian was inducted in Governor General's Executive Council, and this happened first time in Indian history. This was a post like modern day cabinet. So the first Indian who entered into the highest position of cabinet, you have to write his name also, S.P. Sinha. Another clause: two Indians were inducted in India Council Office, London. This was set up in 1858, but first time two Indians were inducted, and you can write their name also. Those two Indians were K.C. Gupta and Sayyid Hussain Bilgrami. These two Indians were the first who entered into India Council Office, London. Another clause, that direct election was introduced. So these are the important clauses which you have to remember as far as Indian Council Act was concerned. So let me remind you that the provisions were that the size of imperial council was expanded to 69. The size of provincial legislative assembly were also expanded. Separate electorate was given to Hindu zamindars, Indian Muslims, and Chamber of Commerce Calcutta, Chamber of Commerce Bombay. And I told you that what this separate electorate was all about. Then one Indian had to be included in Governor General's Executive Council, which was Cabinet, and Mr. S.P. Sinha joined this. Two Indians were included in India Council Office, London, and these two Indians were K.C. Gupta and Sayyid Hussain Bilgrami. And last important provision, direct election was also introduced in this act. So two important aspects we have covered of this act. Now write the third important aspect, and that is its critical evaluation. That means that what are its positives and negatives, and what are those shortcomings because of which the Indian nationalists were unhappy. So the first and the most important, criticism was the provision of separate electorate. You have to understand that why it was given. There are two narratives. One narrative was given by the government as well as by the beneficiaries, and one given by the Indian nationalist and most modern Indian historians. So let's understand what they say. They said, since in those days the voting pattern in India was based on limited franchise, and what today we have, that is universal adult suffrage, that actually came in 1951-52, first time when our Lok Sabha election and Vidhan Sabha election took place. So in those days, suppose out of 100 people, only 5 to 7% people had right to cast vote. So in an area where a particular community, say Muslim or Sikhs, were in majority, but there was no guarantee that their candidate would become MP and MLA, because the voters from their community may not be as much as the voters from other community in the same area, because it was based on educational and financial condition. And since educationally and financially the upper caste Hindus were far better off than other communities in India. Of course, there are always exceptions. So, Muslim League demanded, and the British government also supported happily to give this separate electorate. But what the Indian nationalists argued, and which of course you have to understand in a perspective, that in a particular area where only a particular religious community were allowed to contest and cast a vote, the people of other community living in the same area, say in a particular area where Hindus and Muslims both lived, but only certain Muslims were allowed to cast vote, not Hindus. So these Hindus and Muslims obviously would have some sort of ill wills against them. A polarization sort of thing is started. Please remember, when I said Muslim, it was not given to all Muslims. It was only to a small section of Muslims who got this right to cast vote or could contest. But the point is, even that is small were all Muslims, not Hindu, and that was enough to play this role of divide and rule of the British. So the Hindus and Muslims were brought and pitched against each other after 1857 several times on different occasions through different tools and different means. Election was one such tool which was very smartly used by the British to carry forward their agenda of divide and rule. So obviously, whenever there would be, election, those Muslim candidates would only address Muslim voters, and the Hindus living in that area would feel alienated, or vice versa. So this continued to play a very negative role in Indian politics, and Jawaharlal Nehru rightly wrote a very beautiful words which is like worth quoting: separate electorate, institutionalize communalism in India. I hope you understand the sentence. You know, if a person is communal, his impact would be limited. If an institution is communal, the impact would be much greater. That is why during the debate of Constituent Assembly, that is between 1946-49, some people supported to continue separate electorate. And you should know that it exists today in Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Africa, and some other countries. India chose not to continue and to end separate electorate. During Constituent Assembly debate, Sardar Patel had also said a beautiful line about separate electorate, and that is also worth quoting. And that is, separate electorate is a cancerous substance in body politic of India, and we have to surgically remove it. That means what you wanted to say, no chemotherapy would work, surgically remove it. So it shows, these two statements of Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, that how our nationalists saw separate electorate as a very dangerous ploy, and which became one of the reasons for partition of India. And that is why Indian nationalists opposed this act, particularly because of its separate electorate provisions. Second important criticism of this act was that the House, if you remember, had 69 members at the center, but what was the composition? 36 members came through election, that is direct election, and 33 were nominated. So the number of nominated members were quite high, though marginally the number of elected were higher. But if we just compare our current Lok Sabha, 543 are elected and only 2 are nominated by president from Anglo-Indian community. If you say check it our Lok Sabha, we have 238 elected and only 12 are nominated from different fields. So compared to this number was quite high, and obviously nominated members would be all loyal to the government. Now within 36, there was another bracket that was 50% of them came from general electorate and the remaining 50 came from separate electorate, that is, as I told, Muslim, Sindhu Zamindars, Chamber of Commerce Calcutta, Chamber of Commerce Bombay. Now all these people were also more loyal to the British. So if you add this 18 and plus 33, right? So these 51 members out of 69 were actually loyal to the British. So the entire parliament, or at that time Central Legislative Council, was actually full of yes boss type MPs and MLAs in the Vidhan Sabhas as well. So this was the second biggest criticism. The third big criticism of this act was that there was no change in the power structure at center. Okay, that means the Governor General and his Executive Council enjoyed too much power. And Indians wanted right from 1906 Swaraj, that is self rule, autonomous rule. But forget autonomous and Swaraj, there was, as I told, no big change in the power structure at the center, which disappointed Indians. Another big criticism of this act was that the elected and nominated both members had limited powers, limited powers on budget, limited powers on supplementary questions. Of course, these powers were further expanded in 1919 Act, but most of the budgets and most of the important bills were passed in English Parliament itself, and in India they had a very limited power. So there is a saying about such kind of MPs and MLAs in India कि चना दे दिया मुंह में दांत नहीं दिया. That means that they gave gram without teeth. So they were MPs and MLAs but much without power. Then last important criticism was that the size of franchise was very small, and very small section of society you can call as microscopic section were entitled to cast their vote. So this is what the criticism of the Act Indian Council Act. So I hope you have understood from all these three angles, and whenever, as I told, any such act is asked, if you just understand under three headings which we discussed: the background, the major provisions, and the critical evaluation. Now, in the main exam, they can club point 1 with 2, 2 with 3, 1 and 3, and 1, 2, 3 all. So you have to see that where to give more focus. Sometimes they can also connect one act, say between 1909 and 1919, 1919 and 1935. So this act became very controversial. That is why it is said it is one of the shortest lived act. Shortest lived act because if you see from 1861 to 1892 to 1909 to 1919 to 1935. So 1909 to 1919, only 10 years. The other act lasted much longer. So this is the last important comment on this act. I hope you have enjoyed this, and watch me again on Unacademy, and you would get the announcement of my next classes soon on this very platform. My referral code would remain same, that is Mohammad Tarique. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.